What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about 5 wide receivers that are currently being drafted as wide receiver 3s or later, but I think these players could have the upside to finish as wide receiver 1s in 2024. When we look back at the 2023 season, there were 4 wide receivers drafted outside the top 24 that ended up finishing top 12 in points per game. That was Puka Nacua, Nico Collins, DJ Moore, and Mike Evans. And if you're on the clock and you're drafting, your wide receiver 3, your wide receiver 4, and that player ends up giving you top 12 wide receiver production, that's the pick right there that could take you from, a mid-level team to now one of the top contenders in your fantasy football leagues. So we're going to try to identify some of those potential players here in this video. Let's just dive right into it. We're going to start off with Zay Flowers. Now, he just barely made the cut. On consensus ADP, 4-for-4 ADP, he's being drafted as the wide receiver 25. And he seems like a pretty clear breakout candidate for like a big year too. He was the wide receiver 31 in points per game as a rookie. Very solid rookie season. And I think he should be taking a jump here in year 2. He really started to break out towards the end of the 2023 season. He scored 19 plus PPR points in 4 of his last 5 regular season games. I think he also has the ability to improve on his touchdowns. Scored 5 total touchdowns last year. Played a full season, or I think 16 games. So I think that number could definitely go up. I do think the potential concern here is that the Ravens probably aren't going to be a super high volume passing attack. They were tied for the fewest pass attempts per game last year at 29.1. So sub 30 pass attempts, it's not great. But we actually saw the 49ers last year were at 30 pass attempts per game, and they still had the wide receiver 12 and wide receiver 14 in points per game. You do have Derrick Henry coming in. I still think they're going to be very focused on running the ball, but you have a talented wide receiver here. I think they're going to use them. Plus, we've already seen Mark Andrews average 17.7 PPR points per game in this offense, so it's definitely in the range of outcomes for Zay Flowers to have like a 16-plus point per game season. He's going to be on a good offense. They're going to be high scoring, was talented as a rookie, just seems like a solid bet to take a significant leap here heading into his second season. Now, the next wide receiver is going to be T. Higgins. He's currently being drafted as the wide receiver 28, and I've talked about T. Higgins a few times recently, and I actually think the argument for him being able to finish as a wide receiver 1 is pretty simple. He was the wide receiver 12 in points per game in 2021, so just 2 years ago, he was wide receiver 1 production. Then in 2022, he was the wide receiver 20 in points per game, but he had 3 games where he played injured, played less than 30% of the snaps. If we remove those games, he would have been the wide receiver 12 in points per game again, averaged 16.6 PPR points per game. So on these top offenses, it's definitely possible to see 2 wide receivers finish in the top 12. Obviously, you have Jamar Chase there, so he's going to be like the elite high-end wide receiver 1. But T. Higgins totally has the potential to sneak in like that wide receiver 10 to 12 territory. We actually saw them both do it back in 2021. If you have a healthy Joe Burrow, T. Higgins can stay healthy. I don't see why they can't do it again. In a boom year, T. Higgins could definitely be like a back-end wide receiver 1. And I think there's also the upside where if Jamar Chase gets hurt, is injured, whatever, T. Higgins then has an even higher ceiling and would probably be locked in as like a weekly wide receiver 1 play. The next wide receiver is going to be George Pickins. He's going right after T. Higgins as the wide receiver 29. And honestly, I haven't been someone who's been overly high on George Pickens over the past couple of seasons fantasy-wise, but I think this year he is a really interesting year 3 breakout guy. As a rookie, he was the wide receiver 48 in points per game. Last year, he improved to wide receiver 36 in points per game, but still wasn't a super reliable option week to week. Obviously wasn't giving you, an amazing overall season, finishing as like a fringe wide receiver 3. But looking back at his situation last year, it's really tough to deliver that elite upside when you're playing on a really rough offense while also having another, very good wide receiver playing on the other side of you. Deontay Johnson was there. The Steelers' offense was terrible. They had the 6th fewest passing yards, the 2nd fewest passing touchdowns. Like, that is just not an environment where you're going to get a great fantasy season. So him finishing as the wide receiver 36 honestly doesn't look that bad when you kind of consider the situation. And even on that bad offense, he still showed some solid flashes. He was incredibly efficient with his opportunities. He was 1st in yards per reception, 5th in yards per target. The overall offense has gotten way better heading into the season. Deontay Johnson's gone, so the target competition is pretty much non-existent. Pickens is the clear-cut wide receiver 1. We don't even know who the wide receiver 2 is. The quarterback situation's better. It looks like Russell Wilson's going to be the starter. Obviously, that's not like a perfect quarterback situation, but it's much better than what he was working with last year. So I definitely think George Pickens is a guy who could have that year 3 breakout, in a better system, less target competition. I think Pickins is interesting this season. And then we're actually going to have his former teammate up next here. And Deontay is actually being drafted as a wide receiver 4, going off the board as the wide receiver 39. Deontay Johnson has already proven that he can be a fantasy wide receiver 1. He was the wide receiver 8 in points per game in 2021, so like a top 10 season under his belt. That's impressive. And now I understand from the outside, his situation with the Panthers doesn't seem great. They had the fewest passing yards last year, the second fewest passing touchdowns, but I feel like there are a few things here that make Deontay Johnson interesting and could, come with some upside. He's going to come in and be their clear-cut wide receiver 1. And I think he's kind of in this sweet spot here where the wide receiver room isn't as miserable as it was last year, where you're just going to be able to, lock in on Deontay, completely shut him down. They're a little bit improved. You have Xavier Legette coming in. Thielen and Mingo are still there. Not saying those guys are world beaters at this point, but I don't think like Deontay is going to have so much on him that like he won't be able to produce. So they did improve a little bit at the wide receiver position. I think Bryce Young should be much better, improved group around him. He has a year of NFL experience, and I'm not someone who's super high on Bryce Young like fantasy wise, but it's more so because I don't think he has much upside from like a fantasy perspective. From a real life perspective, I think he can be a fine quarterback. I think he's never going to be a super high ceiling guy, but he can be fine, I think, in the right situation. You have Dave Canales coming in as the head coach. He did great things with the Buccaneers last year. With that offense that people didn't think was going to be very impressive. He made them look like a pretty solid unit. So I definitely think there's the opportunity for Deontay to be that guy who kind of steps in as the wide receiver 1, helps Bryce Young take a leap in year 2, kind of like the poor man's version of like A.J. Brown and Jalen Hurts, Stephon Diggs and Josh Allen. When quarterbacks get that, true wide receiver 1, they can take a big leap. I'm not putting Bryce Young in the Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen category, and I'm not putting Deontay in the A.J. Brown, Stephon Diggs category, but we could still see a jump with these two. Maybe more so like the Justin Fields, DJ Moore situation, even though Fields might not have taken a leap. We still saw DJ Moore come in, be the clear-cut wide receiver 1. Not necessarily a great passing attack, but he still ended up being a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. So I think Deontay is interesting, especially like the wide receiver 4 area. And then the final wide receiver here who's going outside the top 24 that I think has some upside, it's going to be Ladd McConkey. He's being drafted as the wide receiver 44, and he's really lined up to have a big impact in year 1. The target competition is very limited. You currently have Josh Palmer, Quentin Johnston listed as the 2 starting wide receivers. Joshua Palmer's fine, but like he's not going to be vulturing a ton of opportunities. Quentin Johnston, really a miserable rookie year. The odds of him, completely face planting in year 1 and coming back and being super productive, they're not great. So I'm not really worried about anyone stealing targets here from Ladd McConkey. And even though he has the ability to play out wide, it looks like they actually want to keep him in the slot, which I think rookie year for fantasy, I kind of feel like that's a win, especially in like PPR formats, because he really has the opportunity to command a lot of volume. With a pretty limited wide receiver room last year, we saw Keenan Allen just get peppered with targets. He led the NFL with 11.5 targets per game. He had the 3rd highest target rate, 3rd highest target share. He took 56% of his snaps out of the slot. Now, I'm not saying that, Ladd McConkey's as good as like prime Keenan Allen, but Keenan Allen had a great season, and I still think he was falling off a little bit. Like, he still was playing at a very high level, but I don't think that was like, prime form Keenan Allen. He was just in that spot where they didn't have a ton going on at the wide receiver position, and Justin Herbert was just like laser focused on him. I think there's this perception that the Chargers are just going to run the ball like a million times a game. And I think, they're going to want to establish the run. I think they're going to want to be physical. But this is still a team that has Justin Herbert, a top 5 quarterback in the NFL. They spent a premium pick on Ladd McConkey early round 2. So I think they're going to get him involved. Justin Herbert's still going to go out there and sling it. And I think an interesting comparison for Ladd McConkey in terms of his year 1 could be like a Jalen Waddle-esque year 1 season, where, you kind of view Jalen Waddle as a super explosive playmaker, but he really wasn't used like that in his rookie season. He was more of a volume option on a not super great passing attack, but he was 10th in targets, 7th in receptions, had a very low 6.3 ADOT, but he averaged 15.4 PPR points per game. I could see that type of volume coming for Ladd McConkey, and then maybe he ends up turning that into a top 12 fantasy season. So those are going to be the 5 wide receivers that I'm looking at for some high upside plays. We had Zay Flowers, T. Higgins, George Pickens, Deontay Johnson, and Ladd McConkey. Let me know your thoughts on those players. Do you think they have some upside? Do you have some other names you want to throw out there? Would love to hear it. But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.